The gruesome murder of 17-year-old Kelly Ann Bates. Kelly Ann Bates was an English teenager who was murdered in Manchester, England at the age of 17 in 1996 by her abuser, James Patterson Smith, who was 49 years old at the time. She was tortured by him over a period of 4 weeks, including having her eyes gouged from their sockets up to 3 weeks before her death. Before being drowned in a bathtub, she was found tied to her much older partner's radiator by her hair. The autopsy report showed that over 150 different wounds had been inflicted to this poor young girl, such as scalding to her buttocks and left leg, burns on her thigh caused by the application of a hot iron, a fractured arm, multiple stab wounds caused by knives, forks, scissors, stab wounds inside her mouth, crush injuries to both hands, mutilation of her ears, nose, eyebrows, mouth, lips and genitalia, wounds caused by a spade, and pruning shears, both eyes gouged out, later stab wounds to the empty eye sockets, partial scalping. Truly shocking, and the first true crime case I was exposed to. The murder inquiry was headed by Detective Sergeant Joseph Monaghan of Greater Manchester Police, who said, "I have been in the police force for 15 years and have never seen a case as horrific as this." William Lawler, the pathologist who examined Bates' body, described her injuries as the worst he had seen on a murder victim. Smith, who had a history of violence and torture against former sexual partners, denied murdering Bates, but was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment on 19 November 1997. Abducted, raped, stabbed, and organs spilling out. Leaves to tell her story. Alison Botha. On December 18, 1994, Port Elizabeth resident Alison Botha was abducted, raped, stabbed and left for dead by Franz du Toit and Thesis Kruger. They slashed her throat 17 times, so deep she had to hold her own head on as she crawled to the road for help. With her other hand she had to hold in the organ spilling from her stomach, where she had been stabbed more than 30 times. By some miracle the knife thrusts and missed her main arteries, so she did not bleed to death, and was able to breathe through her severed trachea. There is a documentary that is on Amazon Prime called Alison. Worth a watch, but might be traumatic for some viewers. Trailer for Alison. Myra Hindley was an English serial killer. With her partner, Ian Brady, she raped and murdered 5 small children. Hindley grew up with her grandmother in Manchester, England. A close friend died when she was 15, causing her to leave school and take up Roman Catholicism. She met Ian Brady in 1961. Brady was recently released from prison and worked as a stock clerk when the two met. Brady had a strong influence over Hindley. She wrote, "I hope he loves me and will marry me someday." Hindley later noted that he was cruel and selfish, but added that she still loved him. Brady tested her blind allegiance by including her on plans to rape and murder someone, and Hindley agreed. Pauline Reed, 16, was the first victim that they raped and murdered. Their other victims, John Kilbright, Keith Bennett, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans, were all minors. Hindley's brother witnessed the last murder and called the police. Brady told him that the others were buried on Saddleworth Moor, which coined them the Moor murderers. They stood trial in 1966 and pled not guilty to 3 of the 5 murders. Brady was found guilty of 3 murders and Hindley was found guilty of 2 murders, both sentenced to life. In 1970, Hindley broke all contact with Brady, and in 1987, she released a full confession to the media in her involvement in the murders. She applied for parole many times, but all were denied. Myra Hindley died of respiratory failure in 2002 at the age of 60. Ian Brady died of natural causes in 2017 at the age of 79. 2-year-old tortured by 10-year-old boys, then left body on the railroad cut in half by incoming train. He was just 2 years old, and with his mom running errands. She let go of his hand to pay the cashier, and he wandered away. 2 10-year-old boys spotted him, lured him toward them, took him by the hands, and led him away. They took him to a remote location, pushing and kicking at him the whole time. Some people questioned the 2 kids with the crying toddler, but they lied, saying he was their brother, and nobody intervened further. They took him to a secluded spot and tortured him. I don't want to recount the torture details, it's just too gruesome. They left his body on some railroad tracks, hoping that being run over by a train would make it look like an accident. He was found days later, his body severed in half by a train. The boys were caught and became the youngest convicted murderers in British history. Security footage from the day they took James shows them watching children, picking out a target. And they were just kids themselves. They were released at 18. One of them is back in jail for possessing child abuse photos on his computer. The most terrifying thing about this for me is that my own son is only 2 now, and James' murderers were just children too. It was premeditated and intentional and entirely random. Just a momentary lapse in attention and he became a target of 2 murderous children. Children. To think that children younger than my stepson are capable of such a thing, ugh. Everything about this case is just horrifying. The one caught with the CP has had his identity changed about 4 times now for his protection. That's taxpayers' money going to keep this monster protected and safe. Shoemaker kills 36 women with the assistance of a 70-year-old woman. Everything to do with Haj Muhammad Misfui. He was a shoemaker who lived in Morocco in the late 19th and early 20th century. He and his accomplice, a 70-year-old woman called Anna, used to drug and kill young women who came to the shop. Eventually one of the victim's parents traced her movements to the shop, and after the remains of 36 mutilated corpses were discovered nearby, Misfui and Anna were questioned and tortured. Anna didn't survive, but Misfui confessed to murdering them, usually for a tiny amount of money. His initial sentence was crucifixion, a very unusual punishment even then. However, there were many protests from powerful foreign embassies, and Morocco couldn't do much against them. Instead, he was sentenced to beheading, a more common punishment. However, the mood in Marrakech was that this was far too lenient, so they settled on Imirman being walled up alive. A special cell was constructed in the wall of the bazaar, about 2 by 2 by 6 feet. Chains were attached to one wall to ensure he would be kept standing. Misfui wasn't told of his fate until the morning of his execution, when he was led, screaming, in chains and slowly bricked up inside. Once the last course had been laid, the crowd would fall silent until he started screaming, when they would cheer. He screamed nearly constantly for 2 days. On the 3rd day he fell silent. The doctor performed surgery without medical degree. The story of Christopher Dunchake, a Dr. Death who operated out of the Plano and Dallas area. He maimed 33 people and killed 2. He was an alleged neurosurgeon that didn't actually receive a proper medical education to operate, but still did so despite not fully being trained. No hospital would report him or take his license away. They would just pass him off to another hospital to continue injuring or killing people. He was the first doctor to be formally indicated with murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. They came in through the bathroom mirror. On April 22, 1987, 52-year-old Ruth Mae McCoy was murdered by someone who entered her 11th floor Abbott apartment through her bathroom cabinet somewhere between 8:50 p.m. and 9:05 p.m. McCoy called 911 at 8:45 that evening to report that someone in the apartment next door was coming through her bathroom cabinet. Due to the operator mostly disregarding her unintelligible responses, the call was noted as a disturbance with a neighbor. After 2 more calls came through to 911 between 8:50 to 9:04 p.m. about screaming and gunshots coming from apartment 1109, McCoy's apartment, police were dispatched and arrived 10 minutes later. After their knocks went unanswered, the police attempted to enter the apartment using a key given to them by an attendant in the housing office, but left when the key failed to unlock the door. The next evening, 911 received a call from McCoy's neighbor worried and concerned about her whereabouts, considering she had seen police at her door the night before, and she still had not seen McCoy. Chicago police and Chicago Housing Authority security guards arrived back at McCoy's apartment. After the knocks and calls for McCoy went unanswered, officers suggested breaking the door down, but were cautioned not to by Chicago Housing Authority security guards. The following evening, a Chicago Housing Authority official arrived at McCoy's door with a carpenter who drilled a lock on the door. McCoy was found lying on her bedroom floor, shot 4 times, in her left shoulder, left thigh, the right side of her abdomen, and right upper arm. 2 men, Ted Turner, then aged 18, and John Honduras, 21, were charged with murder, home invasion, armed robbery, armed violence, and residential burglary. Witnesses claim that they saw the 2 men carrying McCoy's 19-inch color TV and rocking chair around the project in the early morning hours after her death. Due to lack of evidence, the charges against the 2 men were dropped after 2 years of the trial. The victim's daughter, Vernita McCoy, sued the Chicago Housing Authority for the cause of her mother's death in 1988. Boyfriend murders girlfriend for being too nice. One of my best friends growing up had an aunt that was the sweetest, most generous woman you could possibly know. She started dating a man that fell in love with her because of how sweet and kind she was. After a month or so of being together, he accused her of being too nice to other people, so he bludgeoned her until she was unconscious and cut her heart out of her chest while she was still alive. He thought that it was the worst example of sheer disrespect that she would exhibit kindness towards other people when she was in a committed relationship. He believed he owned all of the good she had to give, and by being nice to people that weren't him, she may as well have been cheating with the whole town. He killed her for being the person he knew her to be when they started dating. The fact people like him exist is terrifying to me. Woman killed and body chopped in pieces. A woman who went to my regular pub was out with her friend during the day, and in the evening she missed a bus home and ended up in another pub. She was tipsy and ended up going home with a man who lived with another male. They both had an obsession with serial killers and murdered her, and after they killed her, they chop her body up. They spend the next week putting her body in plastic bags and hiding them in bushes, etc. They were caught pretty quickly and thankfully are in prison for life. The day she went missing, I saw her in the pub with her friend and stood in the smoking area with her laughing about a pigeon who was chilling too. I have a video where she is in it, and she makes a joke just hours before her death. I think about her nearly every day. It's something that is sort of traumatizing, and she did not deserve such a cruel ending to her life. I grew up in a funeral home. I helped out in the office. When I was about 15, we got a call from a man whose wife and infant baby had been murdered in cold blood. There were very few clues. It made headlines. Cops set up surveillance at the viewing. It was heartbreaking, as the mother was holding the baby in her arms. I was asked to take the flower cards and periodically get the husband and ask if he recognized the names. I then photocopied them and put them back. I did it because I was a kid, people knew me, and I was unobtrusive. I talked to the husband quite a bit. He seemed devastated and shaken. The cops told me they had an eyewitness to someone leaving the house the day of the murder. The witness was a 3-year-old girl. She recognized the man leaving. It was the husband's best friend. Turns out that the friend and the husband had made a pact to kill each other's families and run off with their secretaries. The little girl identified the friend, and I guess one of them cracked. They both went to jail on multiple counts, all on the testimony of a 3-year-old. I still cannot believe to this day that that man stood right beside me multiple times, and I had no clue. I don't think I ever looked at life the same way after that. 12-year-old girl tortured and burned alive by 4 girls. Shonda Scherer. A 12-year-old girl who was murdered here in Indiana by 4 girls who were pretty much strangers. They pretended to be her friends and tortured her for hours, locked her in a trunk, beat her with a tire iron, sprayed Windex on her wounds, and then poured a 2-liter bottle of gasoline on her body and burned her in a field. She didn't die from the torture, she died from smoke inhalation off of the flames burning her own body. The girls murdered her because one of them thought she stole her girlfriend from her, and because Shonda was a copycat. Out of the 4 girls who murdered her, I believe only one is still in prison and is due for release either this year or next. The other 3 have been released and are currently living fairly normal lives, but as far I'm concerned they all deserve life in prison.